Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to read from my paper, and I hope it's going to be okay. I'm trying to look at narrative in two different ways. One way, I'm addressing narrative first as a theoretical concept or a framework of mediation that is linked to the production of knowledge, and second, as a practice of mediation that is located as part of diverse everyday or quotidian practices, which include the struggle for rights, visibility, and participation, particularly in the context of violence and conflict, such as in contemporary Syria. I begin with the premise that narrative can help us understand how discursive entities have prevailed in the production of knowledge of the world, divided between the global north and the global south. I argue that the dominant narratives of the conflict, for example, between Israel and the Palestinians, and which are disseminated in mainstream media, have taken hold and persisted for almost 70 years, serving to support an implicit exceptionalism rooted in the claims of the Zionist movement, while also constructing particular ways of seeing or not seeing Palestine, and certainly not from the viewpoint of the people, the narrated, the people who are talked about. Recent critical interdisciplinary scholarship has shown that this state of affairs is partly the outcome of structural inequalities and conditions imposed by settler colonial practices of Zionism since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and partly a result of the Zionist movement's narrative about itself, which has been normalized and taken for granted in mainstream Western public and media discourses, to the extent that it provided a restricted, if not biased, vision of the conflict through the establishment of patterned processes of thinking aimed at exacting disciplinary power, and which are then normalized in public and media discourses. And perhaps you are familiar with the work of Michel Foucault, who talks about the ways that, disciplinary practices can impose ways of knowing. The role of media in such configurations has been discussed in critical media and cultural studies, but the debate about whether this role can be ascribed to the concentrated symbolic power of media institutions, as Nick Couldry would say, or to global capital, or to the relationship between political entities and the media, or the ability of some entities to cement their control through the media remains open and unresolved. To comprehensively discuss the multiple debates around these questions is beyond the remit of my paper here, but what they seem to agree on is that media are to a certain extent implicated in the ways we understand the world as a web of intermingled subjectivities in which power and knowledge, as Foucault has argued, are part of one system. In the context of Palestine-Israel, we cannot neglect the fact that how we know and what we see is the outcome of the mediated reproduction and repetition of specific narrative practices and tropes that are sustained through particular configurations of space and various processes of differentiations that become naturalized and taken for granted. So even a cursory consideration of the majority of stories and images of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we see in the West, and also in public discourses over any period of time, underlines how our knowledge of the conflict is limited to how media limited to these narratives, and therefore can tell us how the media have been implicated in the reproduction and the dissemination of narratives constituted by what my colleague Fernando Resende has called geographies of power. This is a mode of narrative and representation of identities and places that serve the very interests of the hegemonic agents involved in the narrative creation, and therefore limit our ability to see beyond these dominant frames. Some of the images and narratives that are familiar to us as audiences include, among others, the now familiar photos and stories of sobbing Palestinian women, armed Palestinian militants, the aftermaths of suicide bombings on Israeli streets, and stone-throwing Palestinian youth, often juxtaposed against images of Israeli citizens going about their daily lives in relative normality. Who has the right to narrate? Whose stories and memories enter the history books and whose are dismissed as merely myth or unimportant, are at the core of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Its global narration and appropriation, it's also applicable to how it is understood and how it is to be dealt with culturally and politically. Within the Palestinian context, the right to narrate, to tell a story, was evocatively noted by Edward Said in his article, Permission to Narrate, in which he endeavored to probe the potential power of telling, partly out of despair over the international response to the well-documented Israeli carnage of Lebanon in June 1982, but probably and equally importantly, Said used his analysis as a desperate call on scholars to use theories of knowledge as tools of solidarity, even when they believed that the facts spoke for themselves. And I'm quoting Ilan Pape here. However, if I suggest, as I suggest at the outset, that visibility and narration are at the heart of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, then the diverse contemporary narration and memorialization of the Palestinian Nakba, which is the catastrophe of 1948, and other important events in the conflict represent a discursive and visual strategy of communication through which to counter the Zionist narrative of 1948. There are many examples to show how narrative as a practice of mediation, which is what I'm coming to next, has become a tool for diverse cultural producers and ordinary Palestinians in the margins or on the fringes of the mainstream to subvert the dominant discourse. I can draw attention to examples in film, the various new films that have come out, various new productions, artwork, graffiti, etc., but also in some new media platforms, such as the Facebook page Dear World, which was launched in 2012 to publicize and disseminate ordinary stories of everyday lives in order, as it states, quote, for people to understand us Palestinians and relate to us through our stories, unquote. Another example is a documentary film called A Flying Paper, which is a film which tells the story of a number of children in Gaza who broke the Guinness record in the number of kites flown simultaneously in the same place, and which in certain ways addresses structural inequalities and the realities of living in Gaza under a continuous Israeli siege through telling ordinary stories of everyday lives. Importantly, such narratives gain their discursive power from mundane everyday practices that underline how subjects negotiate their position of power and therefore knowledge with a particular system, and how marginality is renegotiated through these practices. In my work on Syria, I paid attention to what narrative as a practice of mediation can tell us about ordinary people who are marginalized from the totalizing narratives of the ongoing conflict, and how these practices can explain how or why people who are not formally affiliated with political parties or organized in social movements move from what has been called cultures of political disengagement to cultures of political agency and dissent. Paying attention to the role of narration as a practice of mediation is relevant in addressing the diverse and multiple emerging voices in Syria. Sadly, this paper was written before the kind of very visible militarization of the conflict. So we don't see anything else apart from the violence and militarized politics. So, sorry, I will repeat again. Paying attention to the role of narration as a practice of mediation is relevant in addressing the diverse and multiple emerging voices in Syria, where for long a culture of obedience had been enforced and manipulated by Syrian regime practices and discourses intended to ensure that ordinary people and subjects accept official ideology. In my chapter published on this research, on my research done on kind of these narratives of the everyday, I draw on debates in social movement theory and activism, as well as on analysis of a select number of narrative practices that were made visible and circulated on Syrian digital protest websites and created by activists and ordinary people to contest power structures and repressive rule. I suggest that these practices, understood in the Foucauldian sense as quote-unquote knowing practices that come out of particular histories and historical formations, make disorder visible and offer alternative understandings and readings of what the nation is and what national identities stand for. The protest websites that I look at, and these are still available, some of you can get them online, include Abu Nadara, which means it's literally the father of the spectacles. And it's a creative production house and an interactive website used to showcase short films and documentaries produced by Syrian artists in Syria and abroad. And I also look at the Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, which is an online archive of diverse forms of cultural creative production, including songs, graffiti art, documentaries, and cartoons concerned with producing stories of the Syrian Revolution. But it has changed, from the time I started looking at it in 2012, 13, 14, 15. But this year it's really becoming very much about violence. There's a lot of violence on the website. But violence intended to tell stories of violence inflicted on people. So again, it's telling a story. The focus on narrative practices in digital media platforms, I argue, is not intended to privilege social or new media over other spaces where narratives are told, mediated, enacted, and circulated. Rather, it is intended to underline the fact that it is in these new media platforms, particularly YouTube and Facebook, that Syrian activists and ordinary citizens are making public the excluded or unheard aesthetic and narrative aspects of what George Marcuse has called the activist imagery. Within social movement theory, some theorists suggested that it is in telling story of becoming as individuals, as a nation, or as a people, that individuals can establish a sense of an imagination of who they are. I also quote a friend of mine who did an ethnography on Syrian merchants in Aleppo before ethnographic study on Syrian merchants before the uprising in Aleppo. And he provides a compelling argument about how political agency is enacted through what he calls narrated involvement and co-witnessing, while drawing attention to the goal-directed nature of the self as political agent through telling the stories. As such, telling stories can be seen as mobilizational tools that provoke different ways of knowing and responding, particularly in contexts such as in Syria before and during the uprising. Or, as Michel Foucault has argued in Practicing Criticism, quote, as soon as one can no longer think things are as one formerly thought them, transformation becomes both very urgent and very difficult and quite possible, unquote. In this paper, I treat narratives of the everyday as social practices of mediation that originate in and respond to historically and temporally specific political cultures and situations, and as such are meshed in with local and traditional practices that have for long formed common threads between marginalized and excluded communities and forging solidarities and modes of identifications. In a sense, the practice of narrating, irrespective of the genre or the form the story takes, sometimes the stories are incomplete, they're just one sentence, but they somehow elicit or they make people think of the larger story around the kind of the story that is told. So they are part stories. They're not like a beginning, the story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So in this regard, the practice of narrating, irrespective of the genre or the form the story takes, can enact the political and can expand the political field through inscribing it in the narrating act. So in a sense, the argument is that narration is intended to be a political act of communication. There's an intention behind it. As such, narrative becomes the discursive space from which disorder becomes visible. Furthermore, storytelling practices, whether they take the form of an image, a video, a film, a poem, or even a story, are sources of meaning and knowledge production and discursive spaces through which a variety of identities are inscribed and formed, but also through which the dominant readings and representations of identities or the national narratives can be disrupted, and the nation can be read, imagined, and remembered differently. In the larger story, I talk about the ways that in the larger paper, I talk about the ways that the Syrian regime constructed a particular narrative of what it means to be a Syrian national, and relating it to the pan-Arab ideology and so on. I welcome questions in the answering, in the question and answer session. The Syrian popular uprising that began in March 2011 did not start in reaction to a crisis over identity or over what it means to be a Syrian national or a pan-Arab Syrian citizen. Rather, the popular protests and attacks on the symbols of power in different parts of the country were acts of resistance against systems of exclusion and closure. Indeed, the protests began, as we know, in reaction to the Syrian political security forces and their violent treatment of 15 teenagers in the village of Daraa near the border with Jordan. But of course, there was the context of the Arab uprisings as well. But through my work, I found out that while it is clear that the individuals telling the stories do not claim to speak in the name of the collective or use grand ideologies, the narratives they tell evoke vivid, collective, and familiar experiences and practices intended to summon their audiences as involved witnesses. This is the idea of narrative involvement. The narratives and stories these people tell are not always in the form of complete stories, but are usually fragments of lives and memories and experiences. Some are simple utterances, what we call qawl in Arabic, utterance. I don't know whether you've come across Bakhtin, but it's an interesting way of thinking about narrative. Some are simple utterances that, in their simplicity but directness, evoke co-identifications and remembering that are reminiscent of the powerful meanings in the language used in the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings of 2011, exemplified in the phrase, "the people want the collapse of the regime." One example of such an utterance comes in a video posted by a Syrian activist on YouTube at the start of the Syrian uprising, showing a middle-aged man from northern Syria shouting, quote, "I am a human being and not an animal, and everyone is like me." The short video is by no means a complete life story, nor a conventional narrative, but it is an utterance that is familiar to many Syrians, and that, in its simplicity, evokes ways of knowing and remembering lives under repression. There are many other examples that I use. In many of the productions, individuals appear to tell stories that embody larger, more expansive narratives of their lives and hopes, thus becoming metaphors for a collective seeking to disrupt the national narrative, while also demanding co-witnessing by others outside the collective. A very good example of this is the cultural production of the village of Kef Ranbel, which comes across through a powerful storytelling format that tells of lives in a divided Syria, but whose narrative is actually a universal narrative of what it means to be oppressed and colonized. So in a sense, one cannot exclude the idea of what you learn and what you speak about is also informed by other experiences outside your context. I would like to conclude here. I don't know whether I'm beyond my time.
Very good of time. You have 30 minutes if you want.
Okay. Conflict-ridden societies produce sets of relationships and discursive practices that legitimize power, violence, and certain ways of knowing and being, and marginalize those not directly involved. In these contexts, narrative practices are important modes and strategies of political agency and participation, particularly under conditions when actual physical participation in activism and protest is highly risky. As such, attention to diverse quotidian practices of the marginalized and excluded can help us understand diverse modes and strategies of political action in condition when participation in activism and protest is very risky, while helping explain how and why people can move on from what is called cultures of political disengagement to cultures of political agency. Narrative in this perspective is proposed to be understood as an analytical source of meaning, as well as a form of knowledge production and power, and as a discursive space through which identities are inscribed and formed, and through which dominant readings and representations can be disrupted. As such, narrative practices become the embodiment of human individual agency, which, when made visible, is at the heart of the mobilizing potential of narrative as a mode of resistance and a mode of political agency. Thank you very much. I think it's short and might cause a lot of problems and questions, but I'm happy to answer your questions.